On November 6, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt arrived at St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue in New York City to marry a man she did not love, and the entire church could see she had been crying. She was 18 years old. She was the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt, one of the richest men in America. Her dowry, negotiated before she had been consulted about the marriage, was $2.5 million in railroad stock, roughly $75 million in today's money. And the man waiting for her at the altar was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a cold, rigid, 24-year-old English aristocrat who needed her money to save a palace he could no longer afford to heat. She was late. She had been in her room, weeping, for so long that the ceremony was delayed. When she finally appeared at the end of the aisle, her face behind the veil was swollen. The guests noticed. The press noticed. Photographs from that day show a tall, slender girl with enormous dark eyes and the expression of someone walking toward something she cannot stop. She could not stop it. Her mother had made sure of that. Because here is what was happening behind that veil. Consuelo Vanderbilt was in love with another man. His name was Winthrop Rutherford. He was handsome, well-born, part of old New York, and Consuelo had been secretly engaged to him. When her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, discovered the engagement, she locked Consuelo in her bedroom. She told her daughter that if she refused to marry the Duke, she would murder Winthrop Rutherford. When that threat did not work, Alva tried another. She told Consuelo she was dying, that the stress of her daughter's disobedience was causing a fatal heart attack, that if Consuelo did not marry the Duke of Marlborough, her mother's death would be on her hands. The heart attack was fake. Alva made an astonishing recovery the moment Consuelo agreed, and the girl who had been locked in a room and told her mother would die if she didn't comply, walked down the aisle of St. Thomas's in tears, married a man who did not love her either, crossed the Atlantic, and moved into one of the largest private homes in England, a 200-room palace called Blenheim, where she would spend the next 11 years as a prisoner of a different kind. The Duke got his money, Alva got her title, the palace got its repairs, and Consuelo got a marriage so cold, so lonely, and so deliberately loveless that when it was finally annulled 30 years later, her own mother took the witness stand and confessed, under oath, that she had forced her daughter into it. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke," Alva said. "I have always had absolute power over my daughter." That is a mother testifying in a legal proceeding that she had used threats and coercion to compel an 18-year-old girl to marry a stranger for a title. And the investigator wrote it down, and the annulment was granted, and the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt became the most famous cautionary tale of the Gilded Age. This is the story of the girl who was sold for a title, the Duke who was sold for a dowry, the mother who engineered the whole thing and then confessed to it, and the phrase Consuelo Vanderbilt invented to describe what a loveless aristocratic marriage required of a woman. She called it producing an heir and a spare. The phrase is still used today. Almost nobody knows who coined it or what it cost her. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Vanderbilts were the richest family in America, and they were not welcome in polite society, and that humiliation is what started the whole thing. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the patriarch known as the Commodore, had built the family fortune through steamships and railroads in the middle decades of the 19th century. By the time he died in 1877, he was worth roughly $100 million, the largest private fortune in American history, worth several billion in today's money. His descendants, including Consuelo's father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, inherited enormous wealth and spent it on mansions and yachts and art collections of a scale that made European royalty look modest. But money, in Gilded Age New York, was not the same as status. The old families of New York, the Astors and the Livingstons, and the families who had been wealthy since before the Revolution, considered the Vanderbilts new money, vulgar, acceptable as business partners perhaps, but not as dinner guests. The unofficial gatekeeper of old money New York society was a woman named Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor, who maintained a list of the 400 families who mattered in New York and who was in no hurry to add the Vanderbilts to it. This is where Alva enters the story, and where the forces that would eventually lock Consuelo in a bedroom and march her to the altar in tears were first set in motion. Alva Erskine Smith was born in Mobile, Alabama, in 1853, the daughter of a cotton broker. She was not born into the kind of wealth the Vanderbilts had. What she was born with was an ambition so ferocious that it would reshape the social geography of New York City, and, in the process, consume her only daughter. She married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875, and immediately set about conquering the world Mrs. Astor controlled. In 1883, she built a 60-room limestone chateau on Fifth Avenue, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, one of the grandest private homes Manhattan had ever seen. Then she threw a fancy dress ball, so extravagant that it became the social event of the decade. Mrs. Astor's own daughter wanted to attend. Alva let it be known that she could not invite Mrs. Astor's daughter unless Mrs. Astor had first called on her, the formal social ritual that indicated acceptance. Mrs. Astor, forced to choose between her pride and her daughter's wishes, called on Alva Vanderbilt. The gates of old New York society opened. Alva walked through them and never looked back. She had conquered New York. The next prize was Europe, and the vehicle for that conquest was going to be her daughter. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March 2, 1877, into a childhood that was, by any description, a form of training. Alva raised her the way you would train an asset. Her posture was corrected with a steel brace strapped to her spine. She was tutored in French, in music, in art, in the specific social graces required of a woman who would move in the highest circles of the European aristocracy. She was not asked what she wanted to be. She was told what she would be. She would be a duchess, or a countess, or a princess. Alva had not yet decided which title, only that the title would be the highest one available. Consuelo was, by nature, gentle, bookish, and quiet, the opposite of her mother in almost every way. She was also tall, strikingly beautiful, with the dark eyes and the long neck that would later make her one of the most painted women of the Edwardian era. She wanted, as far as anyone could tell, a quiet life with a man she loved. That was not, by Alva's calculation, a relevant desire. When Consuelo was 17, Alva hired a matchmaker. Lady Paget, an American-born hostess, married into the British aristocracy, who had developed a profitable sideline in introducing wealthy American heiresses to cash-poor European noblemen. Lady Paget had the contacts. Alva had the money. And somewhere in England there was a young duke with a crumbling palace and an empty bank account, and all the pieces of the transaction were about to fall into place. The Duke of Marlborough was 24 years old, rigid, dutiful, and sitting on one of the most famous estates in England, Blenheim Palace, the ancestral home of the Churchill family. The palace was enormous, over 200 rooms, and it was falling apart. The roof leaked. The plumbing was medieval. The estate needed an infusion of cash, on a scale that no English fortune of the 1890s could provide. What it needed was American money, Vanderbilt money, and the Duke knew it. He did not love Consuelo. He was, by most accounts, in love with another woman in England, but he needed the money the way Alva needed the title, and both of them, for their own reasons, were prepared to use Consuelo to get what they wanted. There was only one problem. Consuelo was in love with someone else, and she was not going to give him up quietly. His name was Winthrop Rutherford, and he was everything Alva Vanderbilt did not want for her daughter, which is to say he was a man Consuelo had chosen for herself. Rutherford was tall, handsome, well-born, a member of one of New York's oldest families, and by every social standard of the 1890s he was an excellent match. He was part of the 400, the very elite Alva had spent a decade fighting her way into. He was wealthy, though not on the Vanderbilt scale. He was charming, and Consuelo, at 17, was deeply, genuinely in love with him. They became secretly engaged sometime in 1894 or early 1895. Consuelo knew her mother would not approve, not because Rutherford was unsuitable, but because he was not what Alva wanted. Alva did not want suitable. Alva wanted a title. She had spent her daughter's entire childhood preparing her for a transatlantic marriage, drilling the French, strapping the posture brace to her spine, building the girl into a product that could be exchanged for the highest-ranking husband the European aristocracy had available. Winthrop Rutherford, however handsome and well-born, was an American. He had no title. He had no palace. He was not going to make Consuelo a duchess. When Alva discovered the secret engagement, she moved with a speed and a brutality that tells you everything about the kind of mother she was. She locked Consuelo in her bedroom. That is not a metaphor. The 18-year-old daughter of one of the richest families in America was physically confined to her room in the family's mansion because she had fallen in love with the wrong man. Alva then told Consuelo, to her face, that if she attempted to elope with Rutherford, Alva would have him murdered. Whether that threat was real or theatrical does not matter. What matters is that a mother said it to her teenage daughter, and the daughter believed it, because the mother had spent 18 years establishing that her word was absolute. Consuelo still refused. So Alva tried something else. She told Consuelo she was dying. She clutched her chest. She staggered. She performed, with a conviction that would have impressed the actresses of the era, a woman in the grip of a fatal cardiac episode. She told her daughter that the stress of Consuelo's disobedience was destroying her heart, that if Consuelo persisted in refusing the Duke, her mother's death would be her responsibility, and she would carry that guilt for the rest of her life. The heart attack was entirely fake. Alva Vanderbilt was in perfect health, but Consuelo, 18 years old, locked in a room, threatened with the murder of the man she loved and the death of her own mother, did what she had been trained since birth to do. She surrendered. She gave up Winthrop Rutherford. She agreed to marry the Duke of Marlborough, and on the morning of November 6, 1895, she put on a wedding dress with a 5-meter train that had cost nearly $7,000, and she rode in a carriage to St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue, and she cried the entire way. The crowds outside the church were enormous. Alva had made sure of that. She had leaked details to the press for weeks: the dress, the diamond garters the bride would wear beneath it, the flowers, the guest list. The wedding of Consuelo Vanderbilt to the Duke of Marlborough was the social event of 1895, and the American public had been primed to treat it as a fairy tale. The fairy tale arrived at the church late, with a swollen face and red eyes. The Duke was waiting at the altar. He was 24 years old, small, stiff, and visibly uncomfortable. He had, by most accounts, been in love with another woman in England and had given her up for the same reason Consuelo had given up Rutherford, because the transaction required it. He needed the money. She needed the title. Neither of them needed each other, and both of them knew it. The ceremony proceeded. The bride wept behind her veil. The $2.5 million in Vanderbilt railroad stock was transferred to the Marlborough estate, and Consuelo Vanderbilt, 18 years old, became the Duchess of Marlborough. She was going to cross the Atlantic and enter a 200-room palace she had never seen, in a country she barely knew, with a husband who did not want her. Blenheim was waiting. Blenheim Palace was not a home. It was a statement, and the statement was not designed to make anyone comfortable. It was built in the early 18th century as a gift from the English nation to John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, in gratitude for his military victories over the French. It sat on 2,000 acres of parkland in Oxfordshire, designed by the architect Sir John Vanbrugh in the English Baroque style, and it was, by any measure, one of the largest and most imposing private residences in Europe. Over 200 rooms, corridors so long that servants used bicycles to move between wings, staterooms built to the scale of public buildings rather than private ones, a library that ran the entire length of the West Wing. It was also, by 1895, falling apart. The roof leaked in multiple places. The plumbing was antiquated. The heating was inadequate for a building of that size, which meant that in winter the palace was cold in a way that seeped into the bones and stayed there. The ninth Duke had inherited an estate whose grandeur was, by the time Consuelo arrived, largely architectural. The money to maintain it had been running out for decades. That was what the $2.5 million was for. Consuelo Vanderbilt's dowry, transferred in railroad stock on her wedding day, went directly into the restoration of Blenheim Palace. The roof was repaired. The plumbing was modernized. The gardens were redesigned. The Vanderbilt money saved the Churchill family seat, and in return, the Churchill family received an American girl who had been crying at her own wedding and who arrived at Blenheim to discover that the transaction was, in every practical sense, complete. She had been purchased, the palace had been paid for, and the marriage that made both things possible was, from the first night onward, exactly as cold as the building she was now expected to live in. The Duke was not cruel in the dramatic, violent sense. He was cruel in the English aristocratic sense, which is to say he was cold, remote, formal, and completely uninterested in his wife as a person. He spoke to her at mealtimes. He escorted her at functions. He performed the public duties of a husband with the mechanical precision of a man fulfilling a contract, which was exactly what he was doing. Consuelo later wrote that on the first evening after they arrived at Blenheim, her husband informed her, in the manner of a man delivering a briefing, of the duties expected of the Duchess of Marlborough. She was to manage the household. She was to host. She was to represent the family at county functions. She was to produce children. She described the loneliness in her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1953, with a restraint that makes it worse rather than better. She wrote about eating dinner in silence, facing the Duke across a long table, with footmen standing behind each chair, in a room designed for state banquets. Two people who did not love each other, sitting in a room built for 100, eating in silence, every night. She did what was expected. She produced two sons, John, the Marquis of Blandford, born in 1897, who would become the 10th Duke, and Ivor, born in 1898, an heir and a spare, in the phrase Consuelo herself coined, a phrase so perfectly cold and so perfectly descriptive of what aristocratic marriage required of a woman's body, that it entered the English language permanently. It is still used today, most recently about the British royal family, and almost nobody who uses it knows that a weeping American teenager invented it to describe what her own marriage had reduced her to. The boys were raised by nannies and governesses in the English aristocratic tradition, which meant that Consuelo had produced the children the Duke required, and was then largely separated from them by the very household structure that had demanded them. She was a mother in title. The nursery was managed by staff. The Duke made the educational decisions. She was, in the precise language of the arrangement, the vessel. For 11 years she lived this way. She was the Duchess of Marlborough. She sat at the right tables. She wore the right clothes. She performed the role Alva had purchased for her, with railroad stock and coercion. And something during those years, slowly, began to change inside her. Because Consuelo Vanderbilt, the girl who had been locked in her room and married against her will, who had cried at her own wedding and crossed an ocean into a loveless palace, turned out to be considerably more than the obedient daughter her mother had spent 18 years building. She was about to discover that she had a mind of her own, and that discovery would eventually take her out of Blenheim, out of the marriage, and into a life that was, for the first time, genuinely hers. The awakening happened gradually, the way it does for women who have been controlled their entire lives, and then, slowly, discover they have opinions of their own. Consuelo had been raised to obey. Her mother had trained her for compliance, the way a clockmaker trains a mechanism, every spring wound tight, every gear aligned toward a single purpose. And for the first years at Blenheim, the mechanism held. She performed the role. She hosted the dinners. She visited the tenants. She sat through the county functions and the shooting weekends, and the endless, airless social rituals of the English landed aristocracy. She did everything that was asked of her. But the same intelligence that had made her bookish as a girl, the quiet curiosity her mother had tried to redirect toward French lessons and posture braces, was still there. And at Blenheim, surrounded by 200 rooms of silence and a husband who barely spoke to her, Consuelo began to read. She read politics. She read social theory. She read about the conditions of the poor in England, the factory workers and the slum dwellers, and the women who had no vote and no voice and no legal standing. And something in what she read connected with something in what she had experienced, because Consuelo Vanderbilt, the girl who had been sold for a title, understood powerlessness from the inside. She began doing philanthropic work on the Blenheim estate. She visited tenants. She established welfare programs for the families living on Marlborough land. She funded schools. She was, by the accounts of the people who benefited from her work, genuinely engaged, not performing charity for the cameras the way Gilded Age socialites often did, but actually sitting with people, listening, understanding the texture of their lives. Then she went further. She became involved in the women's suffrage movement. This was not a casual association. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, one of the highest-ranking women in the English aristocracy, publicly aligned herself with the cause of women's right to vote, at a time when doing so was socially dangerous. She hosted suffrage meetings, she gave speeches, she used the Marlborough name, the name her mother had purchased with railroad stock, to lend credibility to a movement that most of her social class considered a threat to the natural order. The Duke was not pleased. The English aristocracy was not pleased. A duchess marching alongside suffragettes was an embarrassment to the class that had absorbed her dowry. But Consuelo, for the first time in her life, did not care what the people who had purchased her thought about what she did. By 1906, after 11 years of marriage, she had had enough of Blenheim, enough of the silence, enough of the cold dinners and the mechanical husband and the 200-room monument to a transaction she had never consented to. She and the Duke formally separated. It was not a divorce, because divorce in the English aristocracy of that era was a scandal that neither family wanted. It was a separation, a formal acknowledgement that the two people who had been brought together by money and coercion could no longer maintain the pretense of a marriage. The Duke kept the palace. He kept the boys, as was customary under English law, and Consuelo, for the first time since she was 17 years old, was free. She did not go home to Alva. That relationship had been strained for years, complicated by the fact that Alva herself had divorced William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1895, the same year she had forced Consuelo into a marriage Alva herself no longer believed in as a personal institution. Alva had remarried to Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont and had, in one of the great ironies of the story, become a passionate suffragette herself. The mother who had locked her daughter in a room and sold her to a duke was now marching for women's rights, a conversion that Consuelo watched with feelings she never fully described in public. Consuelo moved to London. She lived independently for the first time. She continued her social work. She continued her suffrage advocacy. She was, by every description of the people who knew her during this period, a different woman from the weeping girl who had walked down the aisle in 1895. She was confident, she was effective, she had a voice, and she was using it. And then, at a dinner party in Paris, she met a French aviator named Jacques Balsan, and for the first time in her life, Consuelo Vanderbilt fell in love with a man who loved her back. Jacques Balsan was everything the Duke of Marlborough was not, which may be why Consuelo fell for him immediately. He was French, warm, adventurous, and completely uninterested in titles or transactions. He was a pioneer aviator who had worked with the Wright brothers and set ballooning records. He flew planes the way other men of his class rode horses, with an ease that bordered on recklessness, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had stared at the ground from impossible heights and decided he preferred the view from up there. He met Consuelo in Paris sometime around 1908 or 1909, during the years of her separation from the Duke. She was in her early 30s. He was around the same age. And the attraction between them was the thing Consuelo had been denied her entire life, which was mutual. He wanted her. She wanted him. Nobody had locked anyone in a room. Nobody had negotiated a dowry. Nobody had faked a heart attack. Two adults had met at a dinner party and liked each other, and for Consuelo Vanderbilt, that simple, ordinary experience was revolutionary, because she had never been allowed to have it. But she could not marry him. Not yet. She was still legally the Duchess of Marlborough. The separation from the Duke was not a divorce, and in early 20th century English society, a legal divorce between a duke and a duchess was a scandal of the highest order. More importantly, the Catholic Church, which the Duke was quietly gravitating toward, did not recognize divorce at all. What the Duke wanted, and what would eventually serve everyone's purposes, was an annulment, a legal and religious declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. And that is where the story circles back to Alva. The annulment proceedings began in the early 1920s, and they required testimony about the circumstances of the original marriage. The question was straightforward. Had Consuelo Vanderbilt married the Duke of Marlborough of her own free will, or had she been compelled? Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, as she was now known after her second marriage, took the stand, and she said, under oath, with the same forcefulness she had brought to every other project of her life, the sentence that has echoed through Gilded Age history ever since. I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter. She said it plainly. She said it without equivocation. The woman who had locked her teenage daughter in a bedroom, threatened to murder the man she loved, faked a fatal heart attack, and marched her weeping to the altar testified, 26 years later, that the whole thing had been coercion. The annulment was granted in 1926. The marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough was declared, retroactively, to have never been valid. 30 years of legal marriage, 2 sons, a palace restored with Vanderbilt money, erased in a single ecclesiastical ruling. The Duchess of Marlborough ceased to exist. Consuelo was, legally and spiritually, as though she had never been married at all. She married Jacques Balsan on July 4, 1921, before the annulment was formally complete, in a civil ceremony in France. It was a quiet wedding. There were no crowds on Fifth Avenue. There were no diamond garters leaked to the press. There was no weeping behind a veil. There was a woman in her mid-40s marrying a man she had chosen for herself, for the first time in her life, on her own terms. The marriage to Balsan lasted 35 years. They lived in France, at a chateau near Tours, surrounded by gardens Consuelo designed herself. They travelled. They entertained. They were, by the accounts of everyone who knew them, genuinely happy together, in the way that people who arrive at happiness late appreciate it more deeply than people who have had it all along. Consuelo continued her philanthropic work throughout the marriage. She funded housing projects. She supported charities. During the Second World War, when the Germans occupied France, she and Balsan fled to the United States, where Consuelo lived for the duration of the conflict, returning to France after the liberation. She had built, at last, the life her mother had never intended for her. Not a transaction, not a title, a partnership, chosen freely, with a man who loved her as a person, rather than as a dowry. And in 1953, at 76 years old, she sat down and wrote the story herself. The book was called The Glitter and the Gold, and it was, beneath its elegant restraint, a reckoning. Consuelo published it in 1953, at 76 years old, more than half a century after the wedding that had made her the most famous reluctant bride in American history. It is a memoir, written in the careful, measured prose of a woman who had been trained since childhood never to make a scene, and the restraint makes it more devastating, not less, because the reader can feel, on every page, the pressure of the things she is choosing not to say. She described the childhood under Alva without ever calling her mother a monster, though the details she provided allow the reader to reach that conclusion without assistance. The posture brace strapped to her spine, the French lessons, the total absence of any conversation about what Consuelo herself might want from life. She described the locked bedroom and the threats without dramatizing them, laying the facts down quietly, one after another, until the pattern was undeniable. She described the wedding, the weeping, the arrival at Blenheim, the first dinner in silence across the long table, the production of the heir and the spare, the phrase she coined and which the book introduced to the general public. She described the 11 years at Blenheim with the precision of a woman who had counted every one of them. And she described Jacques and the happiness she found after the annulment, with a warmth that is noticeably different from the temperature of everything that came before it in the book. The reader can feel her relax. The prose loosens. The woman who had spent 200 pages describing a life she had not chosen begins, in the final chapters, to describe a life she had. The book was a bestseller. The public, which had followed the Vanderbilt-Marlborough wedding in 1895 with fascination and had heard rumors of its unhappiness for decades, finally had the story from the bride herself. The reviews were respectful, the sales were strong, and the phrase "an heir and a spare" entered the permanent vocabulary of the English-speaking world. What Consuelo did not describe in the book, or described only in passing, was what the whole experience had cost the other people in the story. The Duke of Marlborough had remarried after the annulment, to a wealthy American named Gladys Deacon, a woman he had reportedly loved for years and who had waited for him through the entire Consuelo marriage. That second marriage, the one presumably built on genuine feeling rather than transaction, also ended badly. Gladys became reclusive and erratic. The Duke died in 1934, at 62, at Blenheim, the palace Consuelo's money had saved and which had, in a sense, consumed everyone who lived in it. Winthrop Rutherford, the man Consuelo had loved at 18, the man Alva had threatened to murder, married someone else. He married Alice Morton, the daughter of a former vice president, and lived the kind of quiet, respectable, old money life he and Consuelo might have had together if Alva had not intervened. He and Consuelo apparently never reconnected romantically. He died in 1944. Whether Consuelo grieved him privately is something she never wrote about. Alva, the architect of the whole disaster, lived until 1933. She had spent the decades after Consuelo's wedding becoming one of the most prominent suffragettes in America, marching, fundraising, and advocating for women's right to vote with the same ferocious energy she had once used to force her daughter into a marriage. The irony is almost too large to discuss without laughing or crying. The woman who had locked her teenage daughter in a room and denied her the most basic right of self-determination spent the last 30 years of her life fighting for women's right to self-determination. Whether Alva ever genuinely understood the contradiction is unclear. She testified at the annulment that she had forced the marriage. She said it plainly and without shame, but she framed it, in that testimony and in her private conversations, as a mistake rather than a crime, as a mother's overzealousness rather than a mother's abuse. She never apologized to Consuelo in any recorded conversation. Consuelo, in her memoir, described their later relationship as closer and easier, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like forgiveness and might actually be exhaustion. Jacques Balsan, the man who had given Consuelo the only happy marriage of her life, died in 1956. Consuelo was 79. They had been married for 35 years. Less than 2 months before Jacques died, Consuelo had also lost her younger son Ivor to a brain tumor. 2 losses in the same year, at 79, after a life that had already demanded more of her than most lives demand. She lived on for 8 more years, alone, in Southampton, New York, having returned permanently to the country her mother had tried to trade her out of 60 years earlier. Consuelo Vanderbilt died on December 6, 1964, in Southampton, New York. She was 87 years old. She had outlived her mother by 31 years, her first husband by 30, her second husband by 8, her younger son by 8, and the entire Gilded Age world that had produced her. She had been, at various points in her life, the most reluctant bride in America, the Duchess of Marlborough, a suffragette, a philanthropist, a memoirist, and, at the very end, an elderly woman living alone on Long Island in a country she had been traded out of at 18. She was buried not in America but in England, in the churchyard at Blenheim, near Blenheim Palace, next to her son Ivor. That choice of resting place tells you something that the memoir, for all its careful prose, never quite said directly. Whatever Consuelo felt about the marriage that had brought her to England, whatever she endured inside those 200 rooms, the years at Blenheim had produced her sons, and her sons were the part of the transaction she never regretted. She chose to be buried near one of them, in the country she had been sent to against her will, rather than in the Vanderbilt family plot in New York, near the mother who had sent her. She went to Ivor, not to Alva. That is, perhaps, the quietest and most final judgment she ever made. The legacy of the Consuelo Vanderbilt story is larger than any single family, because it was not an isolated case. What happened to Consuelo was not an aberration of the Gilded Age. It was the system working exactly as designed. Between 1870 and 1914, roughly 500 American heiresses married into the European aristocracy, in a mass transfer of New World money for Old World titles that historians now call the dollar princess phenomenon. The American families got prestige, social standing, and entry into a world that had been closed to them. The European families got cash, usually in enormous quantities, to maintain estates and lifestyles their own economies could no longer support. And the women at the center of these transactions were, in most cases, given no more say in the matter than Consuelo had been given. Consuelo was the most famous of them. Her story was the most public, the most dramatic, the most thoroughly documented. But she was not the only weeping bride. She was simply the one who, half a century later, sat down and wrote about it, in language elegant enough to be published and honest enough to be believed. The phrase she coined, an heir and a spare, outlived everything else in the story. It outlived Blenheim. It outlived the Vanderbilt fortune, which was largely spent within 3 generations. It outlived the Gilded Age itself. It became part of the permanent vocabulary of the English-speaking world, used casually, usually without any awareness of where it came from, or what it had cost the woman who first said it. An heir and a spare, 5 words that describe, with perfect surgical economy, what a loveless aristocratic marriage required of a woman's body. Produce the first son to inherit the title. Produce the second in case the first one dies. After that, your biological purpose is complete, and the palace has no further use for you. Consuelo Vanderbilt produced the heir and the spare, endured 11 years inside a palace she had never chosen, walked out, won an annulment on the grounds that the whole thing had been coerced from the beginning, married a man she loved, and lived 35 years with him in a happiness that was, by any standard, earned rather than inherited. She never forgave her mother. That is the title's claim, and the evidence supports it, though Consuelo was too well-bred to say it in those terms. What the memoir records is a relationship that softened with age, grew easier, became cordial, but never recovered the thing that Alva had destroyed in 1895, which was trust. You cannot lock your daughter in a room, threaten to murder the man she loves, fake your own death, march her weeping to an altar, and then expect her, at any point in the remaining decades, to believe you have her best interests at heart. Consuelo visited her mother. She spoke to her mother. She allowed the relationship to exist. She did not, by any evidence available, ever fully trust her again. Look at the whole shape of it. A girl born into the richest family in America, raised by a mother whose ambition consumed everything it touched, trained from childhood for a transaction she had no say in, locked in a room when she tried to say no, marched to an altar in tears, shipped across an ocean to a palace she did not want, married to a man who did not want her, required to produce children on a schedule she did not set, and then, after 11 years, walking out. walking out into suffrage work and philanthropy, and a French aviator who loved her, and a memoir that told the truth, and a phrase that entered the language, and a burial plot next to her son, in the country she had been sent to as a teenager, on her own terms at last. The Gilded Age told Consuelo Vanderbilt that she was a product to be exchanged. Her mother told her that her value was the title she could secure. The Duke told her that her value was the dowry she brought. The palace told her that her value was the sons she produced. She spent the first 18 years of her life being told what she was worth by other people. She spent the next 69 years proving them wrong. The glitter was the palace, and the title, and the railroad stock, and the diamond garters, and the 5-meter wedding train, and the 400 guests on Fifth Avenue. The gold was the woman who survived all of it, and, at 76, sat down and told the truth. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.